term autocidal control refers to a collection of techniques that are meant to control populations of some types of living thing, animal or plant, by disrupting their procreationary capacity. So rather than attempting to control a pest by spraying poisons all over the place, or controlling plants you consider to be invasive weeds by launching huge weed-pulling efforts in the afflicted areas, you might instead figure out how to keep this current generation of pests and weeds from having as many offspring as they might otherwise have, and then repeat that process with the next generation, and the next, and so on, until the unwanted species is either eradicated in the relevant region or reduced to such a small number that its presence is no longer such a big deal. There are all kinds of approaches one might take in trying to achieve this sort of outcome. Experimental genetic modification measures, for instance, have been tried in, so far at least, somewhat limited ways. The idea being to either make the disliked species less competitive in some way, by making them slower and thus more likely to be eaten by predators maybe, or by making them less likely to have offspring, or less likely to have fit offspring. The next generation becomes super slow and clumsy, or they're carriers of a gene that keeps them from procreating as much or at all. And that's alongside genetic modification efforts to try to make them less prone to transmitting certain diseases and such. That approach seems like it could be effective for the procreationary outcomes, and there are quite a few efforts globally that are working to refine and perfect it with mosquito species in particular, specifically the ones that are carriers of malaria-causing parasites and carriers of similar maladies that cause immense harm to local humans and other mammal populations. There have also been attempts to spray mating grounds with pheromones that disrupt mating behavior, or to use what's called the auto-dissemination augmented by males, or ADAM approach, which has been used to decent effect in some trials, and which involves basically just sprinkling a bunch of male mosquitoes with pesticide, releasing them into mosquito mating grounds, and then having them deliver those pesticides to the females they mate with. All of these efforts are meant to reduce populations via some procreationary mechanism, while also attempting to ameliorate some of the other issues associated with other widely used pest and weed control approaches, most of which rely on some kind of chemical being introduced into the right environment, that chemical helping to kill or disrupt these populations, but in many cases also leading to unwanted and often initially unforeseen side effects, like those chemicals messing with other species, getting into the groundwater, and possibly even being associated with maladies in humans. What I'd like to talk about today is another approach, the sterile insect technique, why it's become so popular in recent decades, and how it's being used today to address a burgeoning population of a pest that was previously eliminated in North America using this technique, but which has recently become a problem once more. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. The New World screwworm fly is thus named because its larvae, its baby offspring, are planted in warm-blooded animals. These offspring eat not just dead tissues like the maggots of other flies, but healthy tissues as well. These maggots are often deposited near wounds like cuts or scrapes, but also injuries caused by the castration or dehorning of cattle, or orifices and other sensitive areas with soft tissue like the corner of a host's eye. They don't typically infest humans, but it does happen, and they're most likely to be found on wild and domesticated mammals, the females of the species depositing somewhere between 250 and 500 eggs in the flesh of their hosts, the maggots screwing their way deeper into the host's flesh as they grow, burrowing and eating that tissue for the next 3 to 7 days, at which point they fall off and enter the next stage of their life cycle. By that point, the host may already be dead, depending on the extent of the damage these things manage to cause in the interim. These flies were originally found across the Americas and on some Caribbean islands, and they have long been a headache for cattle ranchers in particular, as they will sometimes infect one cow or goat and then work their way through the entire herd in relatively short order, causing enough damage to seriously injure or kill a whole lot of the rancher's stock. As a result, humans have been trying to get rid of these things for ages, but nothing seemed to make much of a dent in their populations until the emergence of what is called the sterile insect technique, which is exactly what it sounds like, a method of autocidal control that involves sterilizing members of the species, usually the males, and then releasing them back into the population. Variations on this concept were developed by a few different researchers in a few different places around the world in the lead up to World War II. But just after that conflict, scientists working at the US Department of Agriculture realized that they could use X-rays to reliably sterilize male screwworm flies, and that if they did this to a large number of them, then released those males into the local population of screwworm flies, to the point where there are more sterilized males than non-sterilized ones, that would serve to dramatically reduce the size of the next generation, because they would be mating, and the screwworm fly females only mate once, but they would mate with males that cannot procreate. If you then repeat this over and over again, you can eventually wipe out the species in a given region, as they successfully showed in the early 1950s by eradicating all the screwworms on Sanibel Island in Florida. The same technique was then used to kill all the screwworms on the island of Curacao, off the coast of Venezuela. That kill-off achieved in just 7 weeks. Over the next few decades, sterilized male flies were then released across other afflicted US states, and both Mexico and Belize were able to kill all their screwworms in the 1980s, followed by all of Central America in the 1990s. This approach was also applied to other pests, almost always those that either spread disease to humans or threatened some kind of industry like the cattle or agricultural industries. For instance, tsetse flies, carriers of a parasite that causes sleeping sickness, were entirely or almost entirely eradicated from Tanzania, Zanzibar, Senegal, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and Uganda between the 1940s and late 1990s. Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, the carriers of dengue and yellow fever, among other maladies, were sterilized by a bacteria called Wolbachia in Queensland, Australia in the late 20-teens, which reduced the populations of this disease carrier in trial areas by 80%. And Japan eradicated the melon fly, an agricultural pest, in 1993. This approach to pest control has become so popular that dozens of facilities have been set up in countries around the world exclusively to breed and sterilize different species, which can then be shipped to where they will be released. The first of these facilities was built in Mexico in the 1960s, where Mexican fruit flies were bred and then shipped for release in Texas. It's maybe fitting then that a new round of construction is happening today, intending to combat the renewed presence of screwworms in Mexico, which have been making their way up into Texas via these two nations' cattle industries. The U.S. Department of Agriculture recently announced that it will be building a sterile screwworm fly facility in Texas, which has suffered due to the U.S.'s recent decisions to halt the import of cattle from across the border in Mexico due to issues with screwworms hitching a ride on that cattle stock and thus infiltrating U.S. herds. The government tried several times to drop this cessation of imports, as the U.S. cattle industry is pretty reliant on those imports, but each time they tried, new screwworm infestations were found, and the import halt was put back into place. U.S. cattle populations are already at their lowest level in decades, and that's impacting meat and dairy prices, while also putting other warm-blooded animals in the afflicted regions, especially Texas, at risk. The folks behind this new facility have said they hope to be up and running in relatively short order, aiming to be releasing sterile male New World screwworms into the wild within a year. This deployment will operate in tandem with other more direct efforts like fly traps and parasite-sniffing dogs stationed at ports of entry, and there's another such facility going in Mexico as well, which will be adding its own sterilized flies to the cloud of such flies they hope to release in the impacted region in the near future. The concerns here are not just theoretical. Screwworms alone cause an estimated $1.5 billion in damage each year in the United States when they are allowed to spread. And the cost of implementing a sterilization program of this kind usually adds up to something like $1 billion, but that billion spread across decades. Not a bad return on investment, all things considered. These programs are not universally effective, as in some rare cases, non-irradiated males have accidentally been shipped to their intended mating location, temporarily inflating rather than deflating population numbers, though that's super rare. And while these programs are relatively cheap to operate on scale, the cost of producing enough sterilized males to make such an effort effective can be prohibitive when aimed at smaller regions or when attempted by governments or agencies without the budget or stability to see what can sometimes be a long-term project all the way through. That said, this approach does seem to work really well when done correctly, and while its ecosystem impact is not zero, as, for instance, predators who eat these pests might suddenly find themselves without one of their staple food sources, which can lead to knock-on effects across the food web, it does seem to be one of the least food web ripple-producing approaches, as genetic modifications can theoretically lead to far more elaborate, unforeseen consequences, and the widespread spraying of chemicals have semi-regularly led to die-offs and maladies in other local species, in addition to sometimes causing long-term, even fatal health problems for humans who rely on local food and water sources. The book I'd like to recommend today is called 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed by Eric H. Klein. This book tackles a perhaps criminally undercovered portion of history, at least in typical history classes, the late Bronze Age collapse, which saw a bunch of flourishing, very well-developed and sophisticated civilizations in the Mediterranean area suddenly disappear or suffer a cascade of failures that eventually led to their collapse and or disappearance. This led to the disappearance or the dissolution of the Minoans, the Cypriots, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Egyptians of the era, the Mycenaeans, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Trojans. And the author posits that while the so-called Sea Peoples, who seemingly started invading all of these cultures from points unknown around this time, might have played a role in this widespread dissolution and collapse, there were probably other things happening there too, and these things led to a perfect storm of circumstances that culminated with this historical moment during which all of these seemingly flourishing civilizations suddenly got knocked off the historical record. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of 1177 BC by Eric H. Klein. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.